I heard about it from Paul Herman, who invited me to speak at this festival back in late winter. I got an email from him, and he told me that the collected poems of Robert E. Howard was on the verge of publication. And he said, "Are you aware that he was a prolific poet?" And I, embarrassingly, was not. And it intrigued me, since I'm a poet. It was really intriguing to me that he had written poetry, and then I received it, and I couldn't hardly put the book down. I mean, his range of style and his vast knowledge of history and even philosophy and so many different disciplines was sort of mind-boggling to me. I personally write primarily in free verse, so I'm not a formalist the way Howard was a formalist, because he wrote exclusively in form, as you're well aware. But I do write in form quite often. Just the majority of my work is free verse. So I became familiar with him through Paul. I think that's every artist's dream, and it really doesn't matter the genre, but certainly in literature, because many artists, it's not unusual for an artist of even the first rank, a literary artist, to be underappreciated by the general public. And unless you have someone, make an effort to get people involved in establishing your legacy and then perpetuating your legacy, you die. I mean, you generally go into oblivion, the way most writers and other artists end up. So it takes a group effort to create anything lasting. Well, what reached out to me was the rhythmic power of his lines. And when I started reading his collected poems, I found myself reading out loud. I mean, they beg to be read out loud. They're very, very trochaic lines, and I thought of an axe hitting a log, or a cleaver, a meat cleaver. But he sort of hacked his lines and had this propulsive rhythmic power that I've seen in Poe. That's one thing I love about Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven. It was the first poem in school that really struck my poetic fancy, and I had to memorize it back in 7th grade or so. And I was so lost by the music and the music of the language and in the rhythmic quality of Poe that it really didn't matter to me what the meaning was, behind the words. The music was wonderful in itself, and I see a lot of that same characteristic in much of the work of Howard. It's sort of an indirect influence, in my opinion. Much of my work is inspired by actual Texas landscapes. As a writer, I'm intrigued by the variety of Texas landscapes, from the semi-arid to desert areas of far West Texas to the piney woods of East Texas. And I grew up in West Texas in Midland and moved to Brownwood and graduated from Brownwood High School, and then at the age of 20 moved to East Texas, Houston, where I still am. So I experienced the piney woods region there, and it's just fascinating to me that one state can have such a variegated geography, and it's always fascinated me. So I looked for that in Howard, I mean, he must have a lot of Texas landscapes in his work, and I thumbed and thumbed and thumbed, and there were very few pieces, and I knew pretty early on when I was thumbing through the collected poems that his place was of the fertile and brilliant imaginative realm. And having grown up in West Texas myself, I would have to say that it is an alien, hostile environment to literary types, especially budding artists, writers, and poets. It's a land of action, of the old range and the West, and shootouts and action. And if you're busy acting, you don't have a lot of time for reflection. That's one way I put it. So it's a region where football is elevated to the realm of fine art, and Friday Night Lights is not far-fetched. not from the Texas I grew up in. I mean, you know, football is opera, it's symphony, it's ballet, and certainly literature, all rolled in 100 yards under bright lights. And it's difficult for a writer. It takes an enormous degree of self-confidence to continue to work as a writer when you don't really receive a lot of positive reinforcement from your environment. And I think that the weather extremes and the harshness of life, the droughts, I grew up in the 50s in Midland, and I remember sandstorms so severe that I vividly remember extending my arm and not being able to see my fingertips. And I remember wearing a kerchief around my neck to school when I walked to school so I could breathe. And that's awesome to a lot of people when you can't see the sky. You know, it's as if you live your life in a grave. I mean, there's dirt all around you, and then it can be below zero in the winter and over 110 degrees in the summer. So West Texas landscapes get your attention and say, you're really not welcome here, and I'm going to give you a lot of trouble and a lot of flack. And so just get ready. And I really think that this harshness and this alien cultural environment may have accelerated his inward journey into the world of his imagination. It's sheer theory on my part, but it sort of makes some sense to me. He was somewhat contradictory when he addressed the subject of growing up in West Texas, because he went out of his way to say, I'm not saying that my fellow citizens were bad people or that there's anything wrong with them. You know, it's just literature was not their thing, and so it wasn't an environment that was conducive to the production of literature. He was, however, blessed with very educated, progressive parents who loved books, had books in the home, and his mother read to him from a very early age, which I think helped intensify his interest in poetry. That's not going to make one a poet just because their mother reads poetry to them, but it certainly exposes him to the world of poetry much more quickly and would facilitate his development as a poet. So he did have support from his immediate family. And it's just beyond that, there's a question of how much support he had. Because it's football.
What do you say?
Well, he loved football too.
Oh, I know he did. He boxed.
Yeah.
Very physical, tougher than a football player. He didn't have all that, you know, all those pads. Well, what good artist isn't? I think artists are eccentric. Let's say that. I like that word better. Eccentric by nature, and they're trailblazers. They're not followers. They're leaders. So they naturally rebel against authority, figures of authority, and I think were it not for art, most of us would be behind bars, quite honestly. We have raging emotions, you know, mood swings, and many are manic depressive. Of course, many people in the general population are manic depressive, but that's food for thought. There's an emotional honesty in Howard that is not in many artists. And I really think a lot of his work was him speaking. You know, the voices in his poems were in many cases his own voice. And I think that he tackled the violence inherent in the human condition the way few writers have. I mean, it looks like he plunged his psychic and emotional energy headlong into the chaos of violence and disturbing, you know, elements of the human condition, doom and gloom and nihilism and, you know, our doubts and then the heroism of those that are able to make that plunge and then survive. And so that's the heroic element of his work, and it just makes you sort of want to grab a sword. I mean, you know, is there a sword here? We have fights ahead of us, you know. We need to be in combat, in battle. But I don't know of any poet that I'm familiar with in American letters that handles that heroic, warlike quality with the power that Howard has. New as I am to his work, it's most impressive to me. Okay, the writing process is nothing less than sheer drudgery in many cases, and it's grueling. Because in order for it to be art, it has to gleam like a polished stone. And revision, I mean, you can't attend a poetry workshop without the poet hammering on how critical revision is, and you know, you have draft after draft after draft. But obviously, in Howard's case, his output was so prodigious and his life so short that there mathematically was not a lot of time available for all of these endless drafts. So that leads me to believe that by necessity, many of these poems in his collected poems were all but first drafts, which is absolutely phenomenal because they're so finished, except for a few weaknesses here and there. I mean, you know, they're highly polished and impressive for even early drafts. And as for sonnets, sonnets are extremely difficult to write. 14 lines of 10 syllables per line or 5 poetic feet. No room to waste. And you know, you've got to capture the essence of whatever it is you're trying to capture in that very strict, rigid format. And he could go from a sonnet to a 50-page historical narrative of battles, seemingly with relative ease. So he had such an ability to work in so many poetic forms. It's astounding, you know, given his age. We've got to keep in mind that he died at the age of 30. And most poets I know don't even find their own poetic voice until they're around the age of 30. And by 30, we had 4 million or so words of prose and 800 poems. Prodigious. He was a prodigy, a literary prodigy. There's no other way to explain it.